21 horses died while racing or in training at California's Santa Anita racetrack. After a public outcry, the track shut down. Why did the horses die? And what happens to horse racing? That's next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. Here we talk to the key players at PETA and the movement and ask them about how animal rights change their lives and how they stay motivated to make the world a better place for the animals. On today's episode, Whither horse racing. After 21 horses die at Santa Anita racetrack in a 2-month period, was a drugging of horses to blame?
I would guess it is the medication, and that is based on the necropsies of so many thousands of horses who have died this way. When is racing going to get the point is really the question here. We know that medicating horses masks their injuries. We know that injured horses break bones, and horses who break bones die. Why is this allowed to continue?
Kathy Guillermo, PETA Sr.VP, talks about the deaths and the pressure PETA put on Santa Anita to shut down temporarily. The track will reopen on March 22nd, but has promised to make reforms. Still, PETA is calling for the Los Angeles District Attorney to launch a criminal investigation on the horse deaths. In my conversation, I'll cover what's at stake for the horses and racing on the PETA Podcast. But first, thanks again for joining us here at the PETA Podcast. This is episode 59 in our second season of shows. Please share a link with friends. Let them know the animals have a voice on the PETA Podcast. And if you've just found us, welcome. And keep binging. There's lots to listen to on the PETA Podcast. Still wondering about your Canada Goose jacket? It's still cold out there in some parts. You can ditch it and still stay warm and vegan. Listen to episode 44. And for more on animal testing, listen how scientists have turned it into their own welfare system on episode 11. Remember, if you're on Apple Podcasts, don't forget to rate and review the show. It helps the algorithm know that PETA has a podcast on the issues important to you. There's also a link to a survey in our show notes. If you're so inclined, we'd love to hear your feedback. Now, if you really want to help the animals, you can always hit the Donate Now button at PETA.org. And if you're high-tech and have Amazon's Alexa, it's as easy as saying, Alexa, donate to PETA. And now to our episode. Santa Anita Racetrack is one of the premier horse tracks in the nation, if not the world. But even at Santa Anita, the woes of horse racing have been hard to ignore, especially after 21 horses died from December to February of this year. Here's my conversation with PETA Sr.VP Kathy Guillermo on the PETA Podcast.
First of all, the basic facts are that 21 horses since the end of December have broken bones and been euthanized on the track at Santa Anita. And this includes the training track and the grass or turf track and the dirt track. What we know from thousands of necropsies in California that have been done on horses who have died in this way is that they break bones usually because they have a pre-existing injury. They have something wrong at the joint or at the bone. For some reason, they're medicated and put on the track in spite of this, and that bone breaks, and that's the end.
What is the difference between breaking down during training and breaking down during a race? What is the split?
Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be much difference at all. What we know about racing is that whether the horses are training or whether they're on the track, they're subjected to a whole variety of medications. They get anti-inflammatory drugs to deal with swelling. They get painkillers and sedatives and other things to hype them up and other things to calm them down. And this is just the routine method of dealing with horses who race today. And this is the unfortunate part. I think the difference between the training and the racing is that the training is not so clearly observed. The horses are not checked before they get out onto the training track.
It's been wet in Southern California during this period. And a lot of people pointed to the track and said, oh, it's the track. But it's not the track being wet or the track being a dirt surface, is it?
We do know that grass or turf courses are safer and that sometimes tracks can have an effect on how many horses break legs. But in this case, I think that is the convenient smokescreen for the racing industry. And it's a weird thing about people in racing. First of all, they don't want the public to know what a bloodbath the whole thing is. You know, how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of horses die on racetracks around the country. They'd like to keep that secret. And when it does come out, as it has at Santa Anita recently, they'd like to have a convenient scapegoat. Oh, it's this unusual thing we have going on between the weather and the track. I don't think that the evidence points to the track being the cause. Sometimes a track can have an effect. Sometimes a lot of things can play a part in it. But what we do know is what I was just referring to, that 90% of these horses break down because they have an injury. And they were medicated and they were made to get out there and run in spite of the fact that they're injured.
So when horses run when they're injured and they're given some kind of medication or a drug that maybe makes the horses feel better and they do run, what happens to the injury? Does it make the injury worse and then they break down, or do the horses feel like suddenly they're like superheroes and can run, and then that's when the breakdown occurs?
I think it's a combination of those things. And we can compare this to humans who are athletes. And by the way, I might just throw in here that if we had 21 dead basketball players in the last 2 months, there would be an outpouring of anger that the whole sport would just stop dead in its tracks. And we've seen a little bit of that with the horses in this case. But I do think that when you look at a human athlete, you know that when somebody runs a marathon or a half marathon, or for some of us, even a 5K, they're going to feel pretty sore after that. And there is micro damage that is done to the bones and to the joints. And that takes time to heal. If human athletes were simply given medication and told the next day, get out there and run another marathon, eventually that's going to take its toll. So I believe that's what we're seeing here. These horses have a bit of damage from a stress to their joints or their bones, and they're given the medication. But as you point out, they may also be feeling pretty good because they've got painkillers in their system. They've got an anti-inflammatory. They've had a sedative. They're relaxed. So they're not feeling the pain of an injury. So the combination of those two things seems to cause the broken bones.
21 dead horses over the last 3 weeks. We had the rain. The period before that, did we have the same kind of results? Or, I'm just wondering if there isn't another explanation. Because are horses dying all the time in the track at this rate? Why the acceleration of the rate?
This is why we have asked the district attorney to step in. We know that the California Horse Racing Board is going to be looking at these necropsies. They're going to be seeing what condition the horses were in. They will look at the medications. But we need somebody who's actually looking at this from the standpoint of whether or not these horses were in some way abused. Were the trainers or the veterinarians violating anti-cruelty laws by the way that they were treated? We need somebody who's going to be looking at it from more than just what does the corpse of the horse show us. And it may very well be that there are more factors than just the medication and the injury, although evidence seems to indicate that would be the case. It's unusual for Santa Anita to have this many dead horses. And I hate even to hear myself say that, but we have to be very honest about racing. It's carnage. I mean, there are so many horses who die. There are as many as 3 to 5 horses who are dying on tracks in the United States every single day. And this is business as usual in this shocking sort of way with horse racing today. And I think that's why so many people have become extremely upset. They just weren't aware. And I have had a number of people say to me, why is horse racing even a thing in today's world? And that's a very good question.
Well, why is it a thing? Or why is it still a thing? I mean, the heyday of horse racing might have been in the 30s and the 40s. And now we have, for a long time, there was no Triple Crown winner. We've had a number in the last few years, or a couple, but horse racing as a sport, as a popular sport, has really dwindled. And is this the thing that might be the tipping point?
It could very well be. And if I were somebody who was in the racing business today, I'd be looking for a new job. We already know that racing has decreased greatly over the last decade. And just in the last 10 years, the number of thoroughbred foals born in this country has gone down from more than 50,000 to fewer than 25,000. I think it was about 20,000 last year. So it's already going away, probably not fast enough. And there's one reason I think that we could point to for the reason that it hasn't died a natural death already, and that would be slot machines. The subsidies that tracks get, not in California as it happens, but in much of the rest of the country, the subsidies that tracks get from putting slot machines at the racetrack and bringing in gamblers who don't necessarily care at all about thoroughbred racing, but do want to play the slot machines, the racetracks get a portion of that profit. And that has been an artificial prop to the industry for the last probably 20 years.
So it does happen in states like West Virginia and I believe in Pennsylvania. But it would seem to me that if you have the slots, why have the horses? Or if you have legal gambling establishments at the track, it almost puts the track in a different business. Why even go with the live horses, except maybe as a nostalgia kind of thing, in the same way that people hang on to carriage horses around Central Park?
The racetracks were how the casinos got the slot machines in. Most states don't want to allow additional gambling. And the way that the casino owners were able to work their way into these various states was by saying, well, at the racetrack, you have gambling already. How about you approve it? We'll put our slot machines here. We'll give money to the horse track and to the people who breed and raise and train these horses, and won't be in any way intrusive in the community because gambling's already going on here. And the horse people came on board with this because it was a way for them to get what they considered much needed money. And that's how the slot machines got in there. I think the casinos, many of them might very well be happy to see the end of horse racing. Most of the public would be happy to see the end of horse racing. I would be happy to see the end of horse racing. But right now, the slot machines need the racetracks in many cases so that they can legally bring the bettors in to play the slots.
So it's strange that the slot money in some of these states keeps racing going, but in California, that can't happen, right? You can't have casinos in the racing establishments, right?
California has different subsidies. California provides subsidies for people who breed horses. And so there is a bit of a state payout in that way. But I think what we have also seen in California is a reduction in the number of tracks. And possibly the reason for that is that they don't get as much in the way of subsidies as other places do.
All right, Santa Anita, I bring up California law and the way California does things because Santa Anita is in California. What's PETA doing about the Santa Anita situation? What's Santa Anita doing now about it?
Fortunately, after we urged the track to shut down while they sorted this out, they did so. And they have closed up all racing. There is some training going on there, I believe, but there is no racing that the public can go and see right now. And it will stay closed until the 22nd. We are calling on the district attorney to open an investigation into the trainers and into the veterinarians to find out what exactly was going on. We'll be protesting on Thursday outside the district attorney's office in Los Angeles County, trying to urge her to do the right thing in this case. And we're in close communication with Santa Anita to make sure that they are doing everything they can to make sure that not another horse dies. So far, they have promised that they will implement some protocols that should help to prevent the deaths of horses. But I think it won't go far enough. And the public, like PETA, is asking, why is this allowed at all? Why are you allowed to improve things rather than just end things? And ultimately, that's the question that we'll be asking.
And what about the state? What can the state do? You talked about the DA looking into it, but what is the responsibility of the state board and maybe even the governor's office to move in and make some corrective act?
We did ask the governor to step in and shut down the track if Santa Anita did not take that action on its own. Unfortunately, it did. And the governor could play a part here. The California Horse Racing Board is a state agency. And the first thing they need to do is stop pretending that they don't know why horses break down and stop pretending that horses aren't called chemical horses because they get so many drugs, and stop pretending that there's almost nothing they can do to fix it besides wring their hands. The California Horse Racing Board has huge authority within racing in California, and they can take serious action right now. They could shut down the track themselves if they needed to. And certainly they can be looking at medication rules. The first thing I would say that the Horse Racing Board needs to do is outlaw all drugging of horses. And this is just one easy thing that would prevent so many deaths. There's an incredible amount of suffering that goes on, and this is only one bit of it. But if a horse needs to be on medication for injury, that horse shouldn't be near a track. And that's the first thing that the California Horse Racing Board can do, is stop caving in to the trainers who want to keep their horses medicated and racing.
By that answer, it indicates to me that you think drugs are really at the center of this and the drugging of horses.
There may be many reasons for it. There may be 2 or 3 reasons for it. There may be one reason for it. But if there is one reason, I would guess that it is the medication. And that is based on the necropsies of so many thousands of horses who have died this way. When is racing going to get the point is really the question here. We know that medicating horses masks their injuries. We know that injured horses break bones, and horses who break bones die. Why is this allowed to continue?
You mentioned the trainers. We've been talking about the track, but the track is separate. It's its own entity, and that the trainers go to the tracks to run their horses. And the trainers have exhibited a lot of power in determining what the track does. It seems like the track is now taking back some power and is maybe at odds with the trainers, and that the real blame should be the hands of the trainers and owners who must race in order to make money. They must race in order to, get the purses up high. The purses go to the owners then take the purses and pay the trainers. And that's really, if we are to follow the old adage, follow the money, that's where the money is in this sport, right? It's not really in the bettors. It's in how the trainers make money off of their owners, right?
That's exactly right. And the trainers wield a lot of power in this. And first of all, though, I think it's important to say that anybody who is in racing, anybody who's in the racing industry is complicit in the suffering of these animals. And, we can talk about the breakdowns at Santa Anita and the 21 dead horses and the tragedy of the 1,000 to 2,000 horses who die every year across racetracks. But I think it's also important to note that their lives, from the beginning of their training as a 2-year-old until the time that the racing industry is done with them, their lives are not great. Most thoroughbreds spend 23 hours a day in a stall once they begin racing. They begin racing them at the age of 2. They're not physically mature, even. By the time horses are so-called retired or passed on to somebody else or end up at an auction where they may then be sent to slaughter, sometimes at the age of 5, just as they're becoming physically mature, they're burnt out and arthritic. Thoroughbreds suffer from PTSD at the end of their so-called racing careers. This is a cruel industry, and I just think it's so important for people to understand that while we talk about these deaths and the tragedies that they are and why they happened and try to get to the bottom of why they happened, we have to stop and think also that what is going on here is that somebody is whipping a horse to run around an oval as fast as he or she can. And people are putting money down on that and betting on it.
But once again, it's not the bettors so much who are driving this business, the betting handle. It's really, it's the business exists because trainers get people with lots of money who buy horses and then race them. And then the trainers get their fees to train and also to care and feed the horses. And the owners who have invested all this money on sometimes millions of dollars on champion horses, they only get paid off on their investment if they race and win purses. So you're on this, we must train, we must race, we must train, we must race. And many of these trainers only win maybe 30% of the races, if that, maybe 20% of the races. It's a kind of like an ugly vanity sport that's driven by the owners who are manipulated somewhat by the trainers, and the bettors are kind of there for the ride, but they don't really drive this thing, do they?
I get probably 12 or 15 calls from whistleblowers inside the racing industry every week. And PETA has also done a number of undercover investigations of the racing industry, including one of the top trainers, Steve Asmussen. And people can go to PETA.org or Google PETA and Asmussen and see the video from that investigation. And you're right. The trainers are in control in a way that is unhealthy. And I think back to the attempt by some racetracks to make the track surfaces safer as they look at all the reasons why a horse might break down on a track. How can they make it safer? And it was determined that a synthetic track, something that's made of a combination of a composite of materials, was actually safer than running on a dirt track. And so some tracks put those synthetic surfaces in. One of them was Keeneland, a famous racetrack in Kentucky. And in fact, the number of horses who broke bones decreased. So this was a good thing. The trainers don't like the synthetic tracks, though. And my understanding from the media coverage that I have read is that the trainers said to Keeneland, we will boycott you, and you will not get the big fall race, the Breeders' Cup, until you get rid of the synthetic track. And Keeneland caved into that and put the dirt track back so that they could attract the big races. Now, I hear all the time how much trainers care about their horses. But what I see and what I know is they put their horses on tracks that aren't as safe as they could be. They medicate them week in and week out. And then when they're done with them, they dump them off on somebody else.
That's the racing game.
Right.
What gets me is that we don't even talk about what happens to the most successful horses. You talked earlier about how horses can get PTSD by from the things that they experience and from racing itself. A lot of the champion horses become breeders. They are sires, or they're brood mares. And because this is really how the sport replenishes itself. It creates these bloodlines and offspring. And in some ways, does that explain how what we're seeing with the current bloodstock, the current, set of animals, does that play a role at all in either the weakness of the thoroughbred breed and why we're seeing many of them die off due to breakdown?
There are many people who think that's exactly what's going on. And you have to just think about it logically. First of all, I don't think people should be breeding thoroughbreds or any horses at all, because there are so many horses who end up being shipped to slaughter in Mexico or Canada because there's no place for them here. But if you look at what happens with the so-called famous horses, or the ones who win a certain amount of money or are high profile, some of them are retired at the age of 3 to go to the breeding barn. And that's because either they were injured or because there is a fear that they will be injured because they appear to be vulnerable to injury. So if you think about this logically, then they're taking horses who seem to have a predisposition to injury, and they're breeding them, and they're creating more horses who may again have that predisposition to injury. And if you look back at many of the horses who have broken down, and you go back far enough, we have seen some pretty well-known horses in the background in a lot of these. It's just bad feet can mean bad feet from one generation to the next. So breeding could have a lot to do with this and how they're doing it.
What gets me also is that Santa Anita and the whole Los Angeles area has been seen as one of the premier places for racing in this country for a long, long time, right? Santa Anita is billed as the great race place. And yet we see all the signs that show that there's something wrong with racing. And we saw it with the small fields, instead of like full fields of say 10 or 12 horses. We see fields of maybe 5 or 6 horses running. We don't see enough well animals running, or at least the ones who are running, we don't even know if they're well. By the breakdowns, it's maybe a sign that they're not well. And then we see, in fact, 21 dead horses over these, this small period since December. And it makes one wonder about overall the health of racing. And if it isn't time to say, that's it, it was a good game for decades, but well, it was not really a good game, but it's lasted for a long time. But like a lot of things that saw its heyday in the 1930s and the 1940s, maybe it's time for racing to end.
I think that's inevitable. I think that is going to happen. And we need to do as much as we can while it goes out or while we bring about its end to make sure that the horses aren't suffering any more than the racing insists that they suffer. It's funny you say Santa Anita is considered one of the premier tracks, and Del Mar in San Diego and Saratoga in New York, and yet we have these deaths. And it's true. If dozens of horses are dying at so-called premier tracks, what the heck is going on? And then you look at someplace like Arizona, where the tracks are, they're much smaller. There's not the big names and the more famous horses racing there. And there were 50 deaths at Arizona racetracks last year. And one of the things that I noticed as I was reviewing the information on these tracks is that there are not even veterinary examinations of the horses before they race. What seems to separate a so-called premier track from a more bush league track is something as basic as, is there a veterinarian who is looking at the horse before he gets on the track to risk his life so that somebody can make a little profit?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned bush league tracks. I mean, the idea that if this goes on at the top, at the most major league track, right, Santa Anita, boy, you got to imagine, what are the horses like? How are they treated in all these other tracks, not just Arizona, but in places like Texas, Oklahoma, in Arkansas, even in Kentucky, right, where the horse is revered, places like Illinois, Pennsylvania. You've got to wonder, Delaware, right? You got to wonder, what is it like for horses in these other non-premier, non-primetime tracks? And if Santa Anita, the top of the heap, can't get it together, oh boy, it must not be that great in other places.
It's a good point. And, you look at the so-called top, the so-called elite, and you see what happens at these tracks and to the particular horses. We did an investigation of a slaughterhouse in Japan. The United States offloads, or I should say, sells a number of breeding horses to Japan, and some quite famous horses have gone there. And it was discovered that a very famous horse called Ferdinand ended up in a slaughterhouse in Japan after his so-called breeding career had ended. And it was somewhat shocking in the United States. But in the meantime, nobody was talking about the other famous horse, Charismatic, who had been sold to a breeding barn in Japan. And we went over there, and we were actually able to get inside the Japanese slaughterhouse, which is not an easy thing to do, and capture footage of a former racehorse being slaughtered and cut up and prepared to be sold for meat for human consumption. And we released this video, and fortunately, the horses that we profiled were brought back to the United States. So that was a happy ending for those. But the point about this is that at the very top, it's rotten. So if it's at the very top of racing, it's rotten, you can just imagine what it's like at some little track in Louisiana.
So if, you go after the trainers here at Santa Anita, if the track says, look, this is how it's going to be, and they don't let the trainers dictate to the track how it's going to be, and if it's the trainers and the owners who, with their money, who are really running this, they could just take their horses and take their money and go to other tracks in other states. And that would be not so great for Santa Anita necessarily, but it would end racing in California, essentially, huh?
It would. And I think at this point, the trainers are a little worried. Although I do remember 2014 when we released our investigation of Steve Asmussen, and trainers and people in racing were then so worried that they actually were able to introduce federal legislation that would have mandated better control of the drugs. That bill hasn't passed. And here we are again 5 years later, and they're showing the same sort of panic. And they should be panicked because people, there's so much else in life to do. You don't have to go to a racetrack. There are so many options for what we can do for entertainment. And that's pretty much what the public is saying. So if the trainers decide they simply want to go elsewhere, they're going to find the same situation anyplace else.
Now, who would miss it besides the owners and trainers if horse racing were to go away? I mean, if the audience for racing is dwindling, the handle at the track in terms of betting is higher, but maybe it's because the older folks who are into the racing game bet more money. But who would really miss racing if it were to go away?
I think there's a small subset of fans of racing who would probably miss it. But I'll tell you what, those fans aren't very happy about this situation either. We've been working with one bettor from the Midwest who bets on, and in today's world, you can be in Illinois and you can bet on races in New York and California and other places through simulcast racing and betting and online betting. And he had placed a first, second, and third in a harness race, which is a little bit different from the thoroughbred racing we're talking about. These are the horses who have sulkies or little carts behind them, and they trot or pace. And he found that the horses who he had picked to win first, second, and third actually came in second, third, and fourth, and an unlikely horse won. So he was puzzled by that until it came out later that horse had been given an illegal substance called EPO. And he felt that race was fixed, which I would think indeed it was. And he has brought a lawsuit against the owner and the trainer of that horse who was illegally drugged because he believes he should have won something over $30,000. And he didn't win because of that race fixing. And I think every bettor who puts money down on a horse has got to know that the outcome of that race is going to be affected by the condition that horse is in and the medication that the horses have been given either legally or illegally to affect the outcome of that race. And I think the bettors are pretty unhappy about that.
Well, it's the integrity of the game, and that brings us back to Santa Anita, where if drugs were masking the injuries of horses, or were making the horses feel like they could run when they could not run, and in fact, 21 dead horses is proof of that. Well, then that takes care of the bettors in terms of, well, you shouldn't bet on a game that's rigged or a game that lacks integrity. I guess now the focus should be on the owners and the trainers to make things better.
They have so much power. And if every trainer in America said the drugs stop tomorrow, that would do a lot right there. That would do a lot. And there are some trainers who want the medications to be shelved and to get the dozens of veterinarians who are now on the track off helping some other animals instead of injecting sedatives and painkillers into the horses on that track. But the trainers who want this to happen aren't willing to give up the medications they're using because they believe that the trainers using the medications have an edge. So they all need to get on the same page, and they all need to do the right thing.
So what is PETA doing in terms of your protesting this week in Los Angeles?
That's right. We'll be at the district attorney's office in Los Angeles. And again, we're pressing for a criminal investigation because this goes beyond whether or not somebody violated a horse racing rule that may have a $200 fine. This is criminal. This is 21 bodies of horses in 2 months. And something went seriously wrong, and we want a criminal investigation.
And what should people, what should our listeners do if they care about the animals? I mean, is this a kind of thing where just like protesting the circus, protesting, other animal, uses in entertainment, is this one of those things where we've got to see an end to this? What can listeners do?
If they're in Los Angeles, they can join us. If they're anyplace else near a track, they can protest that track. They can certainly go to PETA.org, and we have various action alerts or ways that people can take action to protect horses, and they can certainly stay far away from racetracks. I wouldn't turn on the Kentucky Derby this year. I would just not put it on my TV. As a protest, I would see if we could get those ratings to plummet. They've been going down every year. Why support even by watching this race on television?
I mean, really, the onus is also on the people. If the public doesn't bet, if the public doesn't go there to encourage the sport, then it will die a natural death in the same way that we see other things that have become outdated by technology or just by the way we do things. I mean, one good example is the daily newspaper, not what it was like back in the 30s or 40s. And we get our news fix in other ways. People want to gamble. There's other ways to gamble. You don't have to beat a horse. It seems to me that maybe it's getting to the point where horse racing is more nostalgic than necessary.
Yes, and I will have more nostalgia for a newspaper than I will for a racetrack.
I'd have to agree there. How about as far as one last thing? Because I know that, you have a love for horses that goes back to when you were a kid and used to show horses. People in racing, they love their horses too. How do people who love horses deal with this? And how do they come to the real conclusion that just like we saw the end to the circus, maybe it's time to see the end of racing?
People who love their horses don't beat them. People who love their horses don't medicate them and make them run when they shouldn't be. People who love their horses don't keep them in barns or in stalls for 23 and a half hours a day. People who love their horses don't offload them at the first cheap claiming race that comes up. People who love their horses don't send them to auctions where they then end up in slaughter. So as many times as I've heard the racing industry and people in the industry say, we love our horses, I'm not believing it. I do love horses, and I did have horses and a good deal of time spent with horses when I was younger. I wouldn't ride now. That's just not something I would ever do. I spent time at racetracks until I understood that there was so much cruelty behind racing. People who love their horses don't abuse them, and I think it's that simple.
PETA Senior VP Kathy Guillermo on the horse deaths recently at Santa Anita, the call for the DA to investigate, and for racing to make massive reforms. Get more information and take action about the future of horse racing. Go to PETA.org and go to the show notes for links to videos like PETA's groundbreaking investigation on trainer Steve Asmussen. That's all in our show notes, or just go to PETA.org. And that's our program. Incidentally, if you're a regular listener to our show, you know Kathy Guillermo is my wife. You can find me on Twitter at Emil or on amok.com. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts or wherever you podcast and catch those pods. You can also rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts. Remember, it helps get the word out about the issues you care about. And don't forget, you can help the animals and PETA, especially if you have Amazon's Alexa. Just say, Alexa, donate to PETA. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.